Hello everyone. Hello Noga.
Hello, Ophelia. It's good to
It's,
see you.
so nice to see you as well. And I really wanted to say how happy I am to be part of this event and conversation. We had various conversations as you were writing the book, but as I had the opportunity to reread it just before the event, I have a lot of questions and new ones actually. That's I just wanted to start you on the following, maybe because this is a philosophy event, and as Anthony was saying, I have this genuine interest for philosophy of neuroscience. You dive in, walk us through in the book so many fascinating but also disturbing stories of patients whose disruptions of the mind, as you say, are very challenging to make sense of for people whose minds are not disrupted or not disrupted in the same way, but also for clinicians. And below this difficulty to make sense, I wanted really to know where you saw the role of neuroscience. Where is the role of what you can take to be basically a very general investigation on the biological underpinnings of cognition and the general causal mechanisms that give rise to imagination, perception, memory, all these faculties. Given that these are specific individuals, is it, how useful do you find it for explaining this difficult cases? And there is a sub question coming. how do you find, how useful do you find it for the people around? Because the book, as maybe you will explain, ties together your observing patients being examined by clinicians, but also your own personal story of interacting with them and having to deal with the slowly disrupting the disruption of your own mother's mind as you witness. And so how useful did you as a family member find neuroscience in the way you would approach the case of your own mother? These are the two questions.
Oh, they're pretty big. First of all, I should show the actual cover. I also want to say a word where you see Gloria Origi written on the bottom of the screen, because my Zoom actually became disrupted just before we came on. So I'm not speaking to you from my own Zoom. But that's just side. So I wanted to I mean, to answer your question, Ophelia, which is of course a very, almost goes straight into the very meat of the book. I started off actually just wanting to understand what these patients were doing. I didn't know when I started that I would be going, that I would actually, what I was looking for really. I knew I wanted to understand the sense of self, the embodied sense of self. I knew that. I've always been, as a philosopher, of course, and who always thought about the mind, body, and so on, I always wanted to ask myself those questions in a way that was increasingly empirical. I wanted to actually use empirical studies to actually understand what was going on. But I thought that just theoretical approaches were not sufficient. And actually, that's exactly the point. The point was seeing what was going on when people, as individuals, had, as we say this, yes, these disruptions, which is a very good term that my editor found actually. And one of the points that I do make in the book and that I did try to develop, and I think it's an important one, is that there is the difference, and it's one we can discuss, between the generalizable case, the generalizable brain, the generalizable theory that experimental psychology or neuroscience investigate, and the actual individual with their story, with their context, with their absolutely irreducible story. And you cannot, it's very, when a clinician deals with a person, a clinician is also trying to understand what makes this person a patient, and therefore trying to extract the more general kind of ailment, nameable, categorizable ailment, out of this person's story, but always the story will present itself in a unique way. So that's already a kind of a big gap between two different forms of investigation. One which is based on trying to help a person through empathy. The other one, the one that philosophers and scientists are engaged in, is more trying to understand generally what we are made of. One does not necessarily inform the other, or vice versa. Although there is more and more, translational neurology, there's more and more work in translational work going on, but it's certainly not much of it compared to the amount of, obviously the amount of patients people need, that there are in the world, and the kinds of work clinicians are able to undertake. As far as I was concerned, given that I've always been asking myself these questions, I couldn't help but bring to bear the latest theories and about the embodied and so the kinds of theories that you're developing as well, about attention, about intention, about agency, about the actual body ownership, interoception, which I had already investigated and written about. So it means a sense of the body from within, which is a really growing field in psychology and neuroscience. All these, for me, helped really understand what was going on with these patients and how their sense of self was being disrupted. What was it about their self, which of course is a big philosophical question in itself, what the self is, what was being disrupted. And this particular, these areas in psychology and neuroscience, which are really looking at interactions between brain and body, no longer looking at brain as an isolation, but actually embracing this whole idea that we are entirely embodied creatures, and that the brain is there to serve the body rather than the other way around. Those really helped me understand what was going on with them. Those ideas were not actually brought to bear in the clinical room, because again, the clinicians don't have time to really look at cutting the newest stuff in theoretical developments. But I found it interesting. And then, by the way, I never interacted with the patients. I just was there sitting in the room with, a few residents, some students, small room. I was just anonymous, just another one there. I saw each patient's examination only once. I never knew what happened to them afterwards. I never wrote down their names. I couldn't even, obviously they're all fictitious names, and I changed details, of course. But as I was writing up, once I stopped going to these sessions, I was writing this all up and had chosen those cases amongst the many I saw that were most suggestive, really, of the kinds of questions we philosophers ask and scientists are investigating empirically now about the sense of self and so on. And yes, I saw my own mother developing dementia. And I asked myself, should I really write about this too? And it occurred to me, and some people around me convinced me as well, that yes, you have to write about this. It was a responsibility. Also, given how many people are developing dementia, how many people have dementia in their families, what a confusing, difficult, common problem it is. And it would have been dishonest of me not to actually talk about this in a book about these things precisely. It would have been very strange. So I had to. And so in the end, in the sense, it's a kind of 3-layered book, each one of them feeding on the other, nourishing the other, rather, or enlightening the other. The stories of the patients, the science, and my own experience. A kind of work of kind of enacting phenomenology rather than talking about it. Using the first person in a way to really push the generalizable, in a sense, to really push myself out of my own experience, and try to understand everybody. Yeah.
So maybe here is something that I picked when I was reading the book again. So it seems that in your as part of the story between you and your mother, the causal knowledge that neuroscience and clinical studies have brought helps focus in a prognosis. So, there's this sense that it gives patients and their family, I mean, not in our case precisely, but it helps at least you to say, we know where this is going. And then we move immediately to the first chapter and the first character you introduce us to, where this time we have a character who has, in the circumstances, the complex circumstances you describe, as sort of erased 10 years from their memory. And here it's more the impossibility of existing neuroscientific models to really help with the diagnosis, because it doesn't really make sense. So do you see it as a fundamental tension when it comes to patients, that neuroscience can have these two different roles, that it could help in some cases where we have a good say prognosis. Sometimes it might help with diagnosis, but sometimes it might also prevent us from listening or seeing the person. I mean, what's the I picked really this tension from going from the beginning and the story about your interaction with the doctor of your mother, and then the first case study. So could you sort of...
Yeah. So let's put it this way. I think that actual neuroscience, as developing now, is helpful in understanding what's going on, especially the story of Vanessa, the first story you're referring to, as a woman who wakes up out of a hypoglycemic coma, having forgotten 10 years of her life, and there's no visible neurological lesion. So as for neurology, she's incomprehensible. For psychiatrists, not even a patient, because nothing seems to be wrong with her psychiatric terms. So what you have here is actually neurology and psychiatry both unable to help. Now, this unit where these patients were seen, I have to say already, was a unit formed of neurologists and psychiatrists, because the discipline of neuropsychiatry doesn't really exist anymore in France. It stopped existing, even delivering degrees, I think, in the 70s. And they were really realizing that precisely because these patients, you don't know where to categorize them. You don't know what to do with them. They're diseases that they're patients whose problems are what one calls functional, right? They're not organic lesions, and they're not clearly categorizable and within the labels established by the psychiatry. So, disease is not encapsulated by its name, but we also need to be able to understand what it is we're dealing with. And I think that's very true. The clinicians were extremely capable, but again, they were not thinking along the lines that have been developing in these recent years, in the past, let's say, couple of decades, and especially the past 10 years, in ways that transcend the old dichotomies that make it so difficult to understand what pertains to the mind as an embodied thing, even if you do not see what's wrong with it. What lesions, right? So it's the idea, neurology's idea is when visible lesions, it's organic, it's like dementia, for sure. It's a neurological thing, it's clear. And psychiatry, developed out of this idea that like schizophrenia or states that are not visible, in a sense, it's not by looking at the brain you can understand what's wrong with the mind, even though we can all assume, if we're materialists, that something's wrong with the mind, something will be wrong with the brain. Just as sure as if somebody's brain cells are dying, like in Alzheimer's, their mind, you're going to see effects on their whole being. And this is where I realized I was trying to plug again this gap I was talking about, I was mentioning before, between these in a sense novel ideas that really help us try to make sense, some theoretical sense of what's happening with function in functional diseases. Like, for example, this whole the theory of the predictive brain, which we can talk about if we want. A whole bunch of theories that have to do also with interoceptive issues, with something in the case of Vanessa, for example, the psychiatrists also and the neurologists were both pointing at what we used to call conversion disorder. This idea that comes out of Freud, comes out of hypnosis, comes out of the whole history of neurology and psychiatry as they were played out precisely on the terror of that very hospital where I was seeing the patients at La Petite-Salpêtrière. So the whole history of those disciplines and of how they separated was meeting right there in that room. Freud had studied with Charcot at some point, who had been hypnotizing patients, and when Freud himself realized that later on, when Freud realized that the mind sciences of his day were insufficient to explain what was happening in people's, to explain mental processes, that's when he left, decided to found his psychoanalysis. This idea that he wasn't going to look anymore for organic basis to anything. Even Charcot thought that there was a real organic basis to hysteria. And when he was hypnotizing the patients that he saw as endowed with suffering from hysteria, he was really convinced he was acting on their cerebral processes. So the whole history of hysteria is actually inerrant in a lot of the pages of this book, which actually comes out. A lot of the patients that I'm talking about do have what one calls functional disorders, which are now called, functional neurological disorders, which are starting to be accounted for, but often they are not, they're very hard to categorize clinically. A lot of patients who have these, and many patients do, people like have chronic pain, for example. About 10% of the population anywhere has chronic pain. They don't know who to go to, precisely because of the history of these disciplines, which is in a sense mapped on certain assumptions about mind and body, and about mind and brain in particular as well, that have not yet been completely unpacked in the general perception, certainly not in clinicians' perceptions. So a lot of people, functional patients often will feel like just nobody understands them. Mm. And that's really when you see how philosophical ideas can have really strong effects on actual people's lives.
So thanks. To continue a bit also on this case of Vanessa and the forgetting that is happening in dementia as well. I wanted to maybe touch upon the topic of personal identity, both from a third person point of view, what makes a person still remain the person that they are, but also adopting the perspective of the book, what makes a person feels that they are themselves, and they keep it's many components, as you say. It's feeling that your body is your own body, is thinking that your thoughts are your own thoughts, that your life is your life, that you're in charge and you have agency, and so on. So the book beautifully ties together these two questions: what is personal identity from a third person point of view, and how do people feel and relate to their sense of self from its first person point of view? And of course, here we can think about two important components. One is memory, that we tend to think about as being located in the mind, a set of images and propositions that we know about ourselves. And on the other hand, there is the continuity that is given by our bodies. We have an uninterrupted relation to our own bodies through life. Others also relate to us via our bodies, and that's in many cases they know our bodies more than our minds, or so we currently think. So how do you see the role of both the memory as the mental side of memory, and the role of the body, both in the question of identity and the sense of self? Okay, so first of all, we can think about memory. There are lots of different aspects to memory, right? There's the semantic memory, right, the knowledge of facts, as you know, and episodic memory. Are certainly two explicit forms of memory. Episodic memory being memory of
basically what we think of as constituting our whole lives. In the sense, when we lose our episodic memory, autobiographical memory, we feel we have lost bits of ourselves because we are constituted by this narrative. In a sense, that's one idea. Galen Strawson would argue against this idea of narrativity. I actually talk about that as well in the book. And I think there's a way in which you can cut yourselves loose from narrativity. I saw many kinds of different kind of memory disturbances in these patients, and I think every single patient, mental in a sense, who has some kind of disorder, has a problem with memory. Because you cannot, even though memory and self are not identical, they're definitely overlapped and very much, interconnected. So, for example, my mother's lost all her episodic memory. She forgot her past, actually forgot most of it. Her sense of self actually did not entirely, if you think of there is such a thing as a core self, or as a minimal self, as you would say with Dan Zahavi, core self, I would say with Damasio. If you think that there is such a thing, I think there was that affective memory, in the sense there's a kind of emotional memory, which is embodied, emotions being embodied, that emotional memory remains. I'm convinced of that, actually. I mean, again, I'm convinced. There is data, of course, as well. But I think that basic core self, which is embodied, which is minimal is actually, I think, maybe just, well, it's interchangeable with core in this sense, but I think it may be more useful in this case. Remains, and it's very crucial that it remain. That it does remain, I think, is quite a consolation. The cases of somebody like Vanessa, who again woke up with that 10-year gap. She entered the room. She was a perfectly functional, she's a perfectly capable person, and her memory was working. It's just that she'd lost that bit. So when she lost that memory, she felt that she had lost bits of herself. She didn't quite know what to do with that loss, and also, what was lost also was the self, the selfhood quality of the memory as pertaining to her, the autonoetic aspect of it. It was noetic, not autonoetic. So some of the memories that remained, she knew these things had happened to her, but she didn't feel that they had happened to her. There's no phenomenal quality. There was no subjective quality left to certain memories that did actually come back to her. They were no longer hers. So that the whole process of the subjective feeling of memory is obviously quite complex. How it becomes, and you can also wonder whether it's not connected to the sense of agency in our own life. That I am the agent of my life insofar as I remember, as my memories are my own. I'm the agent of the things that I've done, not just the things I'm doing now. So it says this sense even of body ownership can even extend to the past at some level. You have to see yourself and the embodied being that acted in a certain way from that particular center that is yourself. There was one patient who had DID, with dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called split personality, a debatable complex category. And together, where he had two alters. I mean, he was two. Not some people have many more. And in his case, it was went together also with a dissociation in his limbs. So you could see there was a direct connection between between body ownership and agency and his self of having accepting parts of his past. I mean, what had happened to him was that he'd had a partner who died 10 years before of cancer. He was quite young, actually. And then he was with somebody else. He was happy with this other person, but it was a part of him, that alter, that didn't accept the death of his first partner, that first wife. And would come in and displace the present guy in his present life and stop him from living and make him feel guilty about mourning. And he was aware that this was happening, but he didn't know why or how. And he did not make a connection between that and his problems with his limbs that would take off on their own. And of course, the connection was profound and real, was right there. So he says, well, how do these things really work? We don't know. We know that there's connections, of course. I mean, but again, to go back to the first question about how can neuroscience help us understand this? Well, there's a lot of interesting work that is, and I'm quite optimistic that it's, helping us understand what may be happening with these people, and how it all operates, how the brain and the body are operating together here. Disturbances of memory are, they can happen to all of us all the time. I mean, all of us are constantly filtering out. We constantly, if we were like the hypermnesic people, like, the Oliver Sacks story. Actually, no, sorry, not Oliver Sacks story, the Sherashansky man. If we were like that, then we'd have big troubles. It's impossible to remember everything. We need to forget in order to be able to exist. So that goes together also with this clear assertion that we are each potential patients.
I hear you also in this idea that, in the clinical practice, and it's clear, especially also from the reflections that you have about other cases, like I'm thinking about Toussaint, who has hear voices, but somehow it's blended with his cultural representation that hearing voices might be, let's say, more typical or less a sign of a pathological interaction with the external world than it is in Asian culture. And really it made me think about another big question in philosophy, which is where does the disruption start? So what makes someone dysfunction? Vanessa, as you mentioned, is not per se dysfunctional. It's just she can perfectly function socially. She has recovered her memory from this third person. So there's still an experience is disrupted, but we wouldn't call her case a clinical case of mental illness per se. In some other cases, it's clearer that we would recognize Toussaint as a case of schizophrenia, but maybe you cast some doubt as to whether we should, or we should have some qualifications for ethnopsychiatric reasons. So where do you stand, having witnessed so many cases? I think that's, you might have started with one view of what makes the boundary between the functioning and the disrupted mind, and then also reflected on what type of categories are these psychiatric terms. And here thinking a bit about Ian Hacking notion of this interactive kinds, which feed itself from the science, feeds in how we make sense of our experience and of others, and therefore we're never really picking up on purely objective kinds, but partly constructed. So that's
no, I mean, I think I've made much more room for constructivism in my mind over the past few years, while remaining a scientific realist about science, of course. But I think it's a question of where do they fit? How do they fit together? I think that's the big question in a way. In a sense, there is this continuum again between the normal and the pathological. I think you can define the pathological as a state where you can no longer live your ordinary life, that there is a disruption in your life that you're suffering from. I think that's that. I think that's clearly a clinical category where you are clinically unwell. It can go for any kind of ailment. And I think an mental illness as well. I mean, I think there can be such a thing as a mild depression, which is non-clinical, and a clinical kind of depression where you're no longer able to function, and that requires some kind of clinical care. I think that's important to bear that in mind now, and I think all societies and all cultures will have that. Recognize somebody's unwell. There's such a thing as being ill. Illness is a category that exists in all cultures. Then the causal accounts, of course, will vary. And you could argue that there's no reason why one causal account should be better than another. I still believe that, I am, again, a realist about our science, and I do think we have a lot of very good ideas. But ideas need to be to move, and they are cultural. You have to put them in a cultural context. It's precisely because of the in a sense, so often the lack of perspective on the context within which certain ideas about scientific causality have emerged, that people get stuck with these categories that end up not helping patients. Like, for example, the need to redefine illness that will take into account functional problems as ailments that are real. The idea that, you know, there are all these, it's constantly evolving. Our accounts need to evolve all the time, and they do. The question of ethnopsychiatry, I think, is also very important. And I think it is connected, so we can talk about this. I mean, how connected is it to the recognition that we always need to acknowledge that our knowledge is constantly revisable and uncertain. Toussaint did believe, indeed, that he had been haunted by people back home who were envious of the fact he'd bought a house in the Métropole in France. And his belief helped him understand what was going on. It did not contradict at all the clinical input of the doctors, who were extremely empathic towards his own account, who take it seriously in an act of great cultural empathy. So understanding that this man, that for him, this was real. But that knowing and helping him understand that, knowing even his own belief that he knew this to be real, because for him it was a form of knowledge, wouldn't help him get better. And that the only way for him to actually improve was to actually maybe think that he had certain troubles that they could take care of, like anxiety, and indeed those hallucinations, which for him were voices. And they've culturally, hallucinations have been long, have long been associated with very positive things as well. Communication with ancestors, with the gods, and so on and so forth. And that's fine. I mean, it's, but that's not what was really happening to him. Let's face it, it wasn't what was happening to him, even though for him it also was that. So it's complex, right, to figure this out. How do you do this? And yeah, I mean, that's, yeah.
Noga, I'm sure you could still guide us through both your reflections and the amazing human and scientific stories that you share in the book, but I'm aware we're getting close to the moment where we should open the floor to more questions. So, I mean, we talked about the role of neuroscience in explaining the disruptions of the mind. We talk about the importance of memory in the sense of self, and this idea of the difficulties of building categories. So these are three massive philosophical questions. But if anyone in the virtual room has more along these lines or other questions, please start typing them up in the Q&A part of the chat. We already have a first question from Tia. Tia Jackson is asking, and being aware that this is a massive question again, as she acknowledges herself, but what is the role of consciousness, and do you see that different models of consciousness have different implications for us thinking about the sense of self? So you talked a bit about predictive processing, for instance, which includes, is not limited, but includes accounts of consciousness. So do you see this as influencing or correcting your account of the self in that?
I decided explicitly not to deal with consciousness. I even put it in my first endnote. I was not going to write about consciousness because it's such a philosophical topic, precisely because of that. In a sense, it was too abstract in regard to what the patients were themselves living. In a sense, actually, let's go straight to see what these patients are, as I said, enacting phenomenology. So not even discussing it so much as enacting it, trying to see what it is these people are experiencing in the first person. So, but that said, obviously you can't You can't wriggle out of this one. Yeah, I do believe that the model of, our models help. The models are not the reality, but I think predictive processing really does help account for what is, for conscious processes and non-conscious processes that are, for example, involved in these functional ailments, which demonstrate the extent to which quite, non-conscious processes in the organism can actually have an effect on how we perceive ourselves to be in a conscious way. The problem of consciousness as such, I honestly didn't want it. It's not what the book's about. It's not a contribution to the science of consciousness. I don't know, maybe, do you think it is? I mean, I didn't think of it as such.
I think there's a notion of maybe here that would be helpful, which is a thicker notion of awareness, which you could build into the self-awareness. So this idea of knowing, for instance, not only who we are, but where we fit in space and time. And
with each other.
This is and with each other, which is highly.
Yeah, actually, I did talk a lot about time, the sense of time, and I think that one thing I realized that dislocations in our social identity are, disruptions of the mind go together. Dislocations are a social entity, because we are profoundly social. That's one of the inherently social, and that means also dislocations in shared temporality. So we take for granted how we are sharing our sense of time. What happens in these kinds of pathologies is that the shared time is no longer happening in the same way. And that's one feature of, I think in all Magdalenes, there's a disruption in the sense of time, or self in time that then goes back also, then you can go back to Hume, which I do. You could go back to a whole bunch of ideas also about narrativity as being an important aspect in which you define your conscious self, but, and which, for which consciousness is necessary. Right, and narrativity does not exist without consciousness, or at least we don't think it does. That's a question as well. But in the case of dementia, and my mother, for example, one of the first indications that something's wrong before a person's dementia becomes really manifest is precisely that sense of time. The circadian clock starts going askew, and it's a biological underpinning, I think, of the continued sense of self and time that is going askew. So. Yeah, so you realize that that what we take for granted is our continued presence in time actually is constructed out of a whole bunch of processes that are biological.
I see more questions. So I will give you two questions which are sort of related. One is pointing that we often think of the brain as the most important set of both consciousness, but also sense of self. So where do you exactly see the new focus on embodiment adding to this neuroscientific picture? And the related question we have is whether actually there is the possibility to think about, especially the role of pain in this embodiment, and the question about this present or its ignorance or forgetting. So pain, yes,
it's important. Yeah. That's actually a crucial one. So first of all, I mean, I do give a kind of little history in the sense of, at the beginning of the book, of how we got to this new theories of embodiment, which are relatively new, even they're picking up on old ideas. We return to William James and so on. But I think what we have to bear in mind is that a lot of neuroscience, computational neuroscience, as it developed over the 20th century, was in a kind of new dualism, and I do believe this is the case. It was replacing mind-body dualism of the Cartesian kind with a brain-body dualism. This idea that you could actually, look at the brain on its own as if it were really, functionalist theories, as if the brain and the vat ideas is complete. It just doesn't make sense biologically speaking, because the brain again is serving the body. And then now all this work on interaction, again, research on interoception, research of the brain, heart, brain, gut, how the peripheral nervous system is constantly working with the central nervous system. These things are real. We do not exist without our bodies, just as we don't exist without our brain. Yes, we could have cut off limbs, though we will, that can happen, and you'll still be arguably yourself, even though, of course, there's all these things that can happen. I mean, or stroke, or this, anosognosia for hemiplegia. Then what does that mean about our embodied sense of how we construct an embodied sense of self? All these are big questions, and I think that the focus on embodiment is absolutely crucial, and it's really, and enough with dualism. I think I really believe that. The question of pain is actually related to this, obviously. One criterion for consciousness, in a way, is pain. Actually, today I went to the Peter Godfrey Smith's first Jean Nico lecture, in which he talked also about pain, studies on pain in animals other than ourselves, and crabs and cephalopods. The difference between nociception and felt pain. So in a sense, here we're talking about the feeling of pain is at an index for a certain kind of creature consciousness. Those questions are actually inseparable from questions of if a certain kind of nervous system or embodiment is what we need to give ourselves consciousness, and if so, then we share that with other creatures. I actually think we do to large extents. Then how is human consciousness or human sense of pain on a continuum with that of other creatures might be the most interesting question to ask. So yeah, the question of pain. I mean, pain is a hugely important area of study, obviously. Though again, I don't really talk about pain in this book. I talk about emotional pain, loss and all that, people's feeling confused. But there's never clear cut, because there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of possibility of healing as well. I decided to leave out those patients whose stories were just too indeed painful to tell.
We have, I think, somehow a follow-up on the question of categorizing mental illnesses from Joanna, who's pointing that different cultures have different concepts of illness, and what's considered being functional will differ culturally, even sometimes in the same culture through short amounts of time. We can think about video game addiction and these categories appearing and changing our representation of what it means to be functional or not functional. So given this, do you think that looking for organic markers is really the way forward, is neuroscience good for giving us the correlates of the neural correlates of certain cognitive functions, but really when it comes to grounding this notions of functionality and dysfunctionality?
Look, I think if you start with a point, with a kind of pragmatic starting point, that pathology starts when your quality of life is really affected by whatever it is you're suffering from, then you don't need to worry anymore about what you're categorizing as pathological. I think that at the same time, every person will experience differently how they're, it's the same illness. What may be the same illness? Or again, is it a different illness because everybody's experiencing it differently? I mean, again, or cases of depression, or cases of, or even some viral illness, even the way we each experience COVID differently. Does that mean it's not the same illness? Well, it is the same pathogen in the case of the virus. That's a kind of, we know this, a virus is a pathogen, though it doesn't give illness in everyone. So there's obviously a huge difference between the causal story and the subject and the experience. To draw that line is, what a lot of the committees behind the DSM in America in particular, where obviously that's exactly the questions that they have always debated. And I think I think the results are actually often, as I think a lot of people agree, are not that straightforwardly acceptable all the time. There can be excessive pathologization of normal emotional distress in the DSM. Again, what you culturally call normal, that does change. It's absolutely true. There's a really important questions and complex ones that we need at least another hours actually to debate. It's a different topic in a way, though I do talk about it a bit in the book. I mean, I'm not I think it's important not to be a nominalist about pathology. At the same time, you cannot, I mean, you cannot reduce, or not reduce, you cannot, the pathology is not reducible to the name we give it. The name we give it is indeed a cultural construct. It's dependent on certain points of knowledge that we have, or certain aspects of this particular pathology that seem most salient to us and most saliently identifiable as pathological for reasons that are cultural. And that's absolutely true. And there's this huge variability within that. So, you know, things are not clear cut, oh, pathology or not pathology. And it is helpful then to have a kind of anthropological comparative approach to medicine in that sense, or well, to human nature generally, I think, in that way. Though again, there's, I mean, and then the question of biological markers. No, because often we don't even know what we're looking for. It's not because you don't see it that nothing's wrong. At the same time, it depends again what you're going to define as biological marker. I mean, that depends also on our level of knowledge, of our sophistication. It depends on technology. It depends on the map reader. And also sometimes you may see something that may not cause any difficulty. So, I mean, yeah, it's complex. I mean, and this, I mean, one of my models from way back was Canguilhem, who wrote that book, and Georges Canguilhem, who wrote that book, The Normal and the Pathological, which was an important philosophical teasing out of what we consider to be pathology.
Absolutely. Maybe, and I may have to take this as the last question, but ties together it's a fantastic exercise that and blend of you sharing your knowledge and experience of sitting with the patients and the clinicians, but also sharing some deeply personal emotions and disruptions in your own life, and some vulnerabilities as well, which I think make every reader capable of relating to you as a scientist in a way which is quite extraordinary. So that's something I appreciate grandly in the book. But the last question we had is whether by being both the scientist and the researcher, how has your research transformed the way you dealt or approached your mother's illness and maybe even her care?
I have to say, it's a great question. I mean, it helped me tremendously. I mean, for one thing, having sat in on these sessions, it was a bit like getting a crash course in neurology, particularly neurology, much more than psychiatry. Also because there were often students there, and so the doctors were often being quite didactic, and that really helped me. So I learned a lot about neurology, and it really equipped me to deal with my mother in a way. There are two things, right? There's the daughter and the mother. There's so hard to even start giving an account of what it's like to have your mother not be the interlocutor that she was. That's why the insistence I have on this affective core self-remaining was so crucial. I'm so grateful for that. Her anosognosia, which is typical of Alzheimer's, which, you know, her unaware inability to actually see that she was ill, which is a great savior for her. I mean, that she was actually very happy. So, and that's in a sense something I realize is helpful to other people who have dementia in their family, is to actually, if there is anosognosia, it's a blessing, and it's not always the case, but certainly with Alzheimer's it is most of the time, and which means you have to just adapt to this other person's way of being, and there's a way in which you can continue having a kind of relationship. And I was lucky that I had good carers and all that, which you know, I'm deeply grateful to. But it is a progressive mourning and progressive loss, which I thought I had to write about, because I think by writing about one's experience, you are transcending the I, transcending the self, and that's a consolation. My mother was a poet, so she would have found it kind of consoling that I did this. And then bringing the science to bear. And I mean, there are many things which I wanted to help, in a sense, other people. There are 20,000 words of endnotes, which are the scientific references in there, to actually, in a sense, really help people make, first of all, bring this science, which is often very locked in its academic circles, to a different kind of public. And which, again, by reading this stuff genuinely helped me. It really did. There's a way in which understanding is a kind of consolation. I mean, you certainly mourn, you certainly have sadness, but that's fine. And I'm not going to pathologize sadness or mourning, as the way that the latest DSM has actually to some extent done. So for sure, I think the individual experience is if I was lucky enough in a way to be able to write about it. I think she I hope she would have appreciated it. There was no way for her to know. I did tell her though, one day, Mom, I am writing about you in part, and she sort of half registered it, but she no longer could register quite. So yes, it's not an easy experience, but it's an important one to share.